Professor Madhura Swaminathan. She is a professor and head at the Economic Analysis Unit, Indian Statistical Institute, Bangalore. She has widely published, she has extensively published on issues pertaining to food security, agriculture, rural development. She has co-authored several books: Public Distribution of Food in India in 2000, Agrarian Studies, Essays on Agrarian Relations in Less Developed Countries in 2002, Financial Liberalization and Rural Credit, Socioeconomic Surveys of 3 Villages in Andhra Pradesh, and Dalit Households and Village Economies, among many others. She was a member of the Government of India's high-level panel on long-term food security and has served on the Committee of Development Policy. I was not audible all this while. Development Policy of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations for the period 2013-15. Today, she will speak on her work, How Do Small Farmers Fare? Evidence from Village Studies. In this book, co-authored with Sandeepan Bakshi, they examine the socio-economic characteristics and viability of small producers in different agroecological regions of India, locating them in the broader context of the capitalist development of the Indian agriculture. They address some key questions concerning small farms in the context of contemporary India, drawing on data collected through household and farm economy surveys conducted in 17 villages located in 9 major states of India. They examine issues such as productivity of small farms, economic viability of small farming, multiple sources of household income of small farmers, patterns of input use, and extent of labor performed by small farmers on their own holdings. With doubling of farmers' income and all these issues, suddenly farmers' income has become very important. So Professor Swaminathan will actually tell us how are small farmers faring in India today. So I invite Professor Swaminathan to deliver the lecture, ma'am.
Good morning, everybody. And yeah, I'll come to that. Just let him. Welcome to this session. So right away, let me start by saying I'm drawing a lot. This is an edited volume called How Do Small Farmers Fare? That Sandeepan Bakshi of the Foundation of Agrarian Studies and I edited. Now, the book was published in 2017. But I think the arguments that are being made here are very valid. And if some of you are interested, we can update the data. There are other village studies, the situation assessment survey, and so on. And I think this book is in the library. So for those of you here in CDS, you may be able to access it. And I don't know, but for study material, I guess some of the chapters Xerox could be sent to those who are online. Now, why am I talking about small farmers and who are small farmers? I'll come to definitions. Gosh, the sloping thing is not very convenient. Okay, I'll come to definitions later. But I think we all know that in India, however defined, small farmers or small farms are a very high proportion of total farms. Now, farms, farmers, peasants, there are lots of definitions, but let me just give one example. There are supposed to be about 138 million operational holdings, of which about 110 plus, 85% are small and marginal farmers. And the official definition of small and marginal is marginal farmers are those with less than 1 hectare and small with less than 2 hectares. We have used a different definition, so I'll come to that later. But I think the point really is that in a very standard official way, about 85% of holdings are small holdings, and they account for about 44% of area in the country. So we are concerned about agriculture and lives of people engaged in agriculture. Clearly, we have to be concerned about small farmers, however they are defined. So I think justification for having a lecture on this, or you've already had one by Sarthak, I'll come to that later, I know his views, is there. But what I want to take up today is that small farmers are now being romanticized. And that is what I want to, or we wanted to, with evidence, kind of unpack that. What do I mean by small farmers are being romanticized? Whether it's the World Bank or the United Nations, or it is large NGOs like Via Campesina, everybody thinks small farmers are the answers to our problem, whether it's efficiency, equity, climate resilience, adaptation. In fact, yesterday I saw a video on Twitter put out by the IFAD, International Food and Agricultural Development, which is part of the UN system. A little clip of 1 minute where you think that, small farmers are the answers to everything. And we want to look at what exactly is the economic and social status of small farmers, what is the level of income, what is poverty. I mean, is it a romanticized view that small farmers, and I'll come to some of these arguments in a little bit more detail. We can't address all of them, but we have tried to address some of them at least with the kind of empirical evidence in this book. Okay, so let me just expand on some of these points over here. Efficiency. Now, I don't like that term because the term has to be defined very carefully. But here we just mean simple, less input, more output, or more output. If you can produce something at less cost, that's kind of a basic economic efficiency. So small farmers are said to be more efficient than large farmers. I don't know, you might have heard this in Sarthak's lecture, because I saw that was his title. And did he argue that small farmers are more efficient than large farmers? Huh? No. That inverse farm size, productivity, did he say it's inverse or it's not inverse? Huh? He didn't discuss that. Does not hold. Okay. Oh, then I agree with him fully, because earlier paper I'd read with him was different. Okay. So, but there was this debate, and we'll come to that a little bit. I don't want to get stuck in that debate of the 60s on inverse farm size productivities. What is inverse farm size? The smaller the farm size, the more productive or more efficient. Okay. Larger the farm size, less efficient. And why was that? Or why do you think a small farmer can be more efficient than a large farmer? Now, this audience sitting in front of me will have to answer. I'm looking at them. The audience online can choose to answer if they want. What is it about small farmers? In the 60s, there was evidence which was showing this is the case. And there were a lot of people, Amartya Sen and others, part of this debate. The main idea was that, family labor or your own labor is very important. And the small farmer or peasant, it is true, is very attached to that piece of land, even if it's a very small piece of land. And that's why, in a sense, all the small farmers in India have not sold up and come to the cities. They're still persisting with agriculture, and therefore they will put in more effort. And that may actually sort of compensate for putting in other inputs. And of course, we're talking about a period before the Green Revolution, when purchased inputs, etc., were not so important. So there was a justification for that, which is no longer there. But somehow there is still Ramesh Chand and many others still keep writing articles about how small farmers are somewhat more efficient than others, which I think is based on bad data. I mean, they're not trying to prove something. I don't think is their intention, but some of these national statistics are not very good. We can discuss that later. And that's why we've used detailed village studies. What about the second point? What is social justice and equity? Again, this is, if you look at, if you read, as I said, whether it's the UN or the Via Campesina, that somehow it's more equitable to have production through small farmers. So here I think is an important point to note that in a country like India, we have small farmers and we have large farmers, and we can talk about landlords and capitalist farmers, but we don't really have corporate farmers. Okay, so when some of these organizations talk about how small farmers are better than large, they are talking about corporations, whether it's in Brazil or whether it's in the United States. Whereas in India, almost all farms, 99%, are family farms. We have a small proportion of cooperatives, and we used to have state farms, but most of them are abandoned now. So we are not talking about corporate versus. But why I'm bringing this point is when you read the international literature today, those who are anti-liberalization, anti-corporations are all pro-small farmer. And it's not the same thing, is what I'm trying to say. You have to unpack who and what this small farmer is. Then food security. This is the latest, whether it is the FAO or anyone, they say that small farmers are better to ensure food security. And there are many arguments. I'm simplifying because each of these arguments could take us into a lecture. The idea is that small farms are more likely to grow food crops, and they're therefore more important for ensuring food production and food security, both food production for producers, for consumers, as well as their own food security is better ensured if the farm is actually growing food grains of some kind, cereals, pulses, etc. Then you have social solidarity. This is something that I think is a very important argument internationally, but something which is, I think, very difficult to accept in India. What I'm arguing is that small farmers are not homogeneous. They're heterogeneous, There's differentiation within them. And in particular, not only are there class differences, I'll give an example later, there are caste differences. So when people talk about community in India, I always feel, what community are you going to talk about? It's not that the whole village is one community. And this is again a kind of romanticized idea that is there in the international literature, that the village community we know is, divided in so many axes. I don't want to go into that. So this is also something we need to question, and we talk about the heterogeneity of small farmers in this book. And the last point, which is actually now being extended into climate adaptation, is ecological sustainability. Now, what is ecological sustainability? We know that some of the farming practices that have been used are very heavy in chemical use, have led to soil degradation, have led to problems of water salinity, and so on, and that these farming practices need to be corrected. Now, again, there's a romantic notion that small farmers use less purchased inputs, they are less dependent on markets, and therefore, in some way, they are more organic, natural farming, less chemical input use farming, and so on. Again, I can't tell you whether it's the United Nations Environment Program, whether it's the, what do they call, the climate reports, AR6, etc., coming out of IPCC, all of them have these kind of statements now, that in somehow India may be better able to adapt to climate change and ecological sustainability because we are a country of small farmers. So I think they're putting too much on small farmers. They have to be resilient, they have to adapt, they have to do climate mitigation. And I think this is something that concerned many of us. And that's why we decided to write this book. We didn't do separate research on small farmers. We had been studying villages, but we decided to pull out the data on small farmers to examine some of these questions. So let me go on now. Oh, this is, I mean, this is just, I've talked about this already, that are small farmers more reliant on own inputs, homegrown inputs? Are they more reliant on family labor? This was the traditional view as to why small farmers could be efficient. And let me go on.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah, there's a question.
Sorry
Yeah.
for interrupting, ma'am. Ma'am,
Yes.
our slides are not changing for us.
Well,
We
I've
cannot view
just
the
changed the slide. It's the first time I've changed the slide, but can you see a cover of a book now, a green book?
No, no, ma'am.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
still on the first slide.
Okay, okay, we'll change that. Okay. Yeah, okay. Um,
I'll just call him and.
yeah, sure. Okay, we are not moving to the next slide yet.
Okay, sorry, ma'am.
No, while we correct the slide, I'll continue talking. So the next question is defining small farms. Okay, because if I'm going to talk about our small farmers, this and that, how do we define them? Now, there's a serious problem with the official definition, which is 2 hectares. Can someone say what the problem is? Well, it could be 1 or 2.5. I'm not talking about that. It's not that it's 2 or 2.5. 2 hectares or 5 acres is the official definition of all those below are small farmers, and some with even less than 1 hectare are, or 2.5 acres are marginal. What is wrong with this definition? Is it anybody? Okay. So anybody online? Do you think 2 hectares is okay, or we need to modify it in any way when we're studying a country like India? Off? Okay, so there's a comment from the floor that family size should be incorporated. Okay. Yes, that is relevant. So one of the very important things that any of you, particularly in a Marxist understanding of the rural economy, is that scale and size are not the same thing. Can I use this mic? Then I can talk while the slides. What is the difference between scale and size? Size here is the extent of it. So size of a farm, when I was saying, it is 2 acres, 3 acres, whatever it is. And size is not the same as scale. Give it a big hint now. What determines scale of production? Input use, investment. Okay. So a 4-hectare farm is not double, it's double the size of a 2-hectare. But if that 4-hectare farmer is also not having any tractor, using the same methods of production, low inputs, it's not a such a difference in scale of production. So scale of production depends on many things, very importantly in India, on irrigation. Is it, can you see the definition of previous slide? No. Oops, can I go back? No, and can we go back to slide 3? So, even after all these years, 2 years of online. And the photo is there, no? That slide is still there. So if you, for example, have 2 hectares of irrigated land, then you can have multiple crops on it. Whereas 2 hectares of unirrigated, please don't look at the slides, all of you. I'm talking to you and there's nothing there. 2 hectares of unirrigated land can have only 1 crop. 2 hectares of irrigated land can have multiple crops. So if you go to Bengal, you have 3 crops, rice, potato, rice in some areas. And if you go to a dryland area in Anantapur, you have just 1 crop. So the returns from that land, the investment in that land is very different. And that is one immediate reason why, if anybody does a regression or correlation using extent of land holding, you're not going to get any significant results. You may get some correlations, but they're meaningless. Because what are you measuring? Yeah, okay, that was a bit of a, so what we have defined, this one, huh? This one, okay. Can you see definition of small farmers? Can you see that slide? Anybody online?
Yes, Professor. Thank you. Works.
Thank you. Okay. So
Yes,
we
ma'am.
have, we've just, this is very arbitrary, I know, but we have defined small farmers as either 2 hectares of unirrigated land or 6 hectares, sorry, the other way around, 2 hectares of irrigated land or 6 hectares of unirrigated. So essentially, we've said that, you know, the returns from unirrigated land is sort of 1/3 of what it is in irrigated land. Now, if any of you read the literature on land reform and land laws, etc., whenever ceiling surplus was defined, it was always 1 acre of a 10 acres of wetland or 25 acres of dry land, etc., because the productivity of these two plots of land, 2 hectare land or 10 hectare land, is not the same. Okay, so we restricted our analysis to data. We have used data from 17 villages. Now, I don't know if I click it here, I've not done that. Does it work? Okay, we've used data from 17 villages in different parts of India. No. Okay. But for this presentation, I'm only looking at 8 villages because discussing 17 will be too much in an hour. And so I picked villages from different parts of India, and I want to spend a minute on them. But what we did is we looked at all households. We excluded landlord households, that is households that do not cultivate on their own, they do not engage any family labor. We looked at all other cultivator households, and then we used our small and large farmer definition. So those households are dependent on business or other enterprises are also, they may own land also, but they're not really into farming. Is there some? Okay. Is there an echo? Or is there something that's wrong?
Excuse me. Can you please mute yourself, Surendra Singh? Can you please mute yourself?
Tell everybody. Is it a question? Is it a question? Is it a question?
You asking something?
Yes, if you have a question, speak up. Can you type in your questions? Huh? Can host mute them?
Yeah. Vivek's coming. This is something
Any
else.
question from here or everything's clear while they're waiting for? Yeah.
Good now. Now it's yeah.
It's mentioned. Yeah.
So why the government of India uses that classification, you have to ask them. But it's simple. So you have such a big country. For every state, if you have a different acreage, for some things it's easy to, when you want a national estimate, as I said, 85% are less than 2 hectares. It's useful for some ballpark study. But to study incomes. Okay, so a question is that to study incomes and returns, which is what we're going to do today. Our focus is on what are the income levels? Are they higher for small farmers than large farmers? If so, why? If not, why? I can tell you the answer. We find quite systematically that incomes of small farmers per hectare are lower than of large farmers. Obviously, in total, large farmers have 10 hectares, 20, they're going to be more, but per hectare. So this is efficiency or productivity part of it, the returns per hectare. So if we compare a 2 hectare irrigated and unirrigated in the same group, doesn't make sense. And so for our purpose, this seemed sensible. It's not that government of India is not aware of it. As I said, when land reform laws were enacted by states, 1 hectare of irrigated and 1 hectare of unirrigated was not given the same weight. So that there are differences in productivity of land and therefore in returns to a cultivator is recognized. But somehow in the agricultural statistics in India, now we have stuck what? We have made a uniform classification. Okay. Huh? Any other question? No, in this book, we have made adjustment all through. Okay. Now, in other studies, as I said, if you look at Ramesh Chand, he's got a paper on inverse size productivity. Have they made adjustments? No. Okay. So you have to look at each study. We have made this adjustment throughout the book. Okay. Now, yeah. Let's get back to, so I will talk about these villages a little bit now, but more as we discuss the incomes and returns. But just to give you an example of the kinds of villages we have, I mean, some of you will be from these districts, starting from Anantavaram in Guntur districts. That's a very highly productive rice growing irrigated area. As compared to the next village, Anantapur is one of the most driest and drought prone districts of Andhra Pradesh. Then you have Bijnor in Western UP, which is again sugarcane, paddy, irrigated, wheat. You have Buldhana, which is a cotton growing Vidarbha region, the region of high farmer suicides and dryland cotton. You have Karnataka, Mandya, which is again a rice growing, sugarcane growing, high productivity district. You have Kalaburgi is Gulbarga. It used to be called Gulbarga district in northern Karnataka, very dry, growing finger millet, pearl millet, bajra, jawar, etc. Again, you have Rajasthan, you have a sort of dry village, and then you have Punjab, Jalandhar, which is your typical wheat paddy, green revolution village with good irrigation, etc. Okay, and very few small farmers actually in that village. So just I've chosen some, so that when we look at the differences, we get some contrast, because even after adjusting for this simple adjustment for scale, actually one should look at ownership of means of production like tractors and other things and bring that also into scale. And a young student colleague, Gaurav Bansal, has done a paper on that, defining large and small using total investment in the review of agrarian styles. Now, I have already, so let me go on. So I have to speed up a little bit. So some things I've just put a few numbers, but first is, let me get it over with market participation in different ways. This idea that small farmers do not participate in the market, that they are in somehow subsistence farmers, is not valid anymore in India. So in fact, for all of you who use subsistence farming, please be very careful. It's very, very rare to find a cultivator who uses own seeds, produces only for own consumption, and doesn't engage in the market either for purchase of inputs or purchase or sale of output. Now, I must say the only exception, which is not there in the villages we have studied, I mean, we have studied them, but it's not in this book, is tribal villages. So this kind of somewhat subsistence farming or, not engaging much with the market does exist. We have studied some villages in Anupur district in Chhattisgarh, etc., but they are not part of this analysis because there's also not so much differentiation in small and large in these tribal villages. So that is an important exception. What is the point I'm trying to make? How many homegrown seeds? So this is for rice or paddy. It's about 50% in the two villages with a lot of irrigation, which is Karnataka and Punjab. It's about 80% in Western UP, 40-50%. So in a particular year, now please remember this is cross-section data. It's not time series. So some of these farmers will rotate. But every year, 40-50% of farmers are small farmers are buying seeds from the market. Now, what about manure? I want to spend a few minutes on this because in this whole literature on ecological sustainability now, use of manure has become very important. that let's not use too much of chemical fertilizer, let's use manure. Now, manure is very rarely, manure availability depends on availability of animals, particularly cattle and sometimes other goats and so on. And what we've shown here is that, yes, small farmers, when they use manure, they largely do it when it is homegrown manure. Okay, so 80% in Anantavaram. It's the lowest in Barvat Khanderao because, as I said, this is an unirrigated village in Vidarbha, and not many households are having access to fodder and feed, and therefore not having cattle. But about 30% of even small farmers are buying manure. Okay, and this availability of manure and cost of manure can be quite high. I'm not going to go into that. Now, this is I've not gone into all the other inputs, but I just want to make a quick point because I'm just looking at the time. We have an hour. In terms of purchased inputs, including seeds and manure, small farmers are engaging in the market. It depends on the crop. It depends on the location of the village. It depends, so if you like, on the kind of cropping system. Now, the next point, which is a myth about small farmers, which I think we need to break down, is that small farmers rely only on family labor or own labor, okay? And labor of men and women and children. Child labor has gone down, we find in our studies, but it's still there in some places. Now, this table, let me just say the table, then I'll tell you the explanation for it, shows that, let me take two villages to give an example. In Anantavaram village, which is in Andhra, where they grow rice largely, and the second crop is either a pulse or maize, 64% of the labor employed in crop production by small farmers is hired labor. In other words, small farmers are paying others to work on their fields. Now, how many of you expected this number? Did you think it's okay? That's normal. I mean, this is not the literature, the picture played in the literature. Now, here I'm drawing on a chapter by colleague Niladri Thar, who's done a lot of work. His thesis was on these villages, and he's continued to work on this. In most parts of India, particularly where you are growing crops in irrigated areas, and where crop value is high, and where crop operations have to be timed very carefully, almost all households hire labor. Okay, so this, please understand, almost all small farmer households hire labor. Of the total labor they use, 65% is hired, but they are also working, so 25% is their own labor. And in fact, although hired labor is expensive, and in particular in this village in Andhra Pradesh, the common practice is not to use what we refer to as casual or daily paid labor. You may have heard this term in other parts of the workforce also, but to use contract labor or piece rated labor. So the contract or the piece rate is, say, for transplanting. So say 1,000 rupees an acre for transplanting. And there may be a group of workers, a gang of workers who are 10 in number or 3 in number, it varies. So even though this is expensive for small farmers, this is what Niladri has showed in several papers, they are using hired labor for many reasons. One of them being that, if you have to transplant your own farm with just one family worker or two, it may take several days. And the crop operations are such that you have to complete it. So the timing of crop operations, the availability of labor, you may not be able to hire 1 or 2 workers. They may only come in the gang because that is a labor practice. So once these labor practices or labor institutions develop in a village, whether you're a small farmer or a large farmer, you are participating in those labor market practices. You can't exclude yourself and operate on your own. So we see that in all the irrigated villages, Harevli in Uttar Pradesh, Kharsondi, Madhya Pradesh, Tehang in Punjab, sorry, no, I'm sorry, I was looking at hired labor use. Let's take one example. Let me take example of Revasi in Rajasthan, where it's only 20%. So you have hired labor, but it's much less. And that's because this is in Sikar district, some of you maybe know, which with very limited irrigation, largely comprising small farmers and who are cultivating on their own farm with family labor. So the character of the village is such that the most male workers who are who can have migrated outside. This area is famous for sending people to the army, now sending people to the Gulf and so on. And therefore, largely it is a family labor-driven agriculture, not very high productivity. Agriculture is not the main source of income in a dry Rajasthan village. So we can talk about patterns and you can ask me about questions. But I think this is something that surprised us also when we started seeing these findings about 10 years ago from our studies of Andhra Pradesh, when we started seeing these findings that even the smallest of farmers are hiring paid workers. And in fact, as I come later to the statistics on costs of cultivation, you'll see that the costs of hired labor are one of the highest components of total costs of production, even for small farms. Okay, I'll have to skip along now. Okay, this should have come earlier, sorry. But this is taking this view that small farmers are producing again only for their own consumption of a subsistence. We can see that the share of marketed output in total production. Now, again, some of these have to be done crop-wise. I can't talk aggregate over all crops. So again, you see that in Bukkachera and Andhra Pradesh, where they're growing groundnut and they're growing some pulses, they're keeping 42% they're selling, whether it's small or large. They're keeping 60% for home consumption. Whereas in Anantavaram, where they're growing rice, it's a big area of rice sale and rice marketed surplus, they are selling 70%, whether it's a small farm or the large farm. So one of the things that comes out in this analysis, and whatever these variable we look at, is that there's a heterogeneity of small farmers across villages. So when I talked about small farmers not being homogeneous, it's within a village, we're finding different kinds of differentiation, but also very importantly, across villages. And we can't study every, there are 5.5 lakh villages in India. We can't study every village and do a comparative picture. But these differences across villages do seem to follow agroecological differences. And I'll come again later. Broadly, if you look at irrigated villages, we look at certain types of cropping pattern, we see certain types of behavior. So again, when we talk about small farmers, this is another thing that you can't compare a small farmer in Punjab. There are very few there, but with a small farmer in, say, Anantapur district. Okay, this is share of marketed output for wheat. I'm going to skip that. Okay. Because the main focus of my lecture they can't see the title. You all can't, the title is not visible, huh? Oh, I'll have to read it out. I'll come to this table in a minute. So in this debate on small farmers and efficiency and farm size and productivity, there are two components of the debate. One has looked at quantitative differences in yield, and the other, even in the 1960s, looked at profitability or return. Okay, and our focus in this book is on incomes of small farmers and therefore on this concept of profitability. And we're taking a very simple measure of that, which is the what we call the farm business income or net income from farming, which is the gross value of output minus the total cost of production. Okay. So total value of output, that is output times price, and output here includes all the products and byproducts, straw, anything that you sell based on your crop cultivation, and total cost of cultivation, and the difference is your sort of your net income. Okay, so it's just a simple definition. So here we look at the gross value of output. So this table is showing you the gross value of output from crop production per hectare of operational holding. Okay. So you have the two groups, small farmer, large farmer. It's in rupees per hectare at 20, 10, 11 prices, constant prices. So we can compare across villages, though that's not the purpose of my exercise. And with one exception, what do you see? That the gross value of output per hectare, so per unit of land, is lower for small farmers than large farmers. Okay. In Anantavaram, it's 92,000 hectares and 2,81,000. Okay, so it's a very big gap. And that is the village with the largest gap, I think. But in Western UP, Harevili, it's 59,000 and 76,000 and so on. Okay. In Punjab, it's 94,000 per hectare and 1,31,000 per hectare, etc. So we find, and I'm not going to show this data, so I'm just going to jump ahead and give you the reasoning, and you can check out the numbers later, that the difference in gross income. So what is gross value of output is gross income. So that's our first measure of income differences, is mainly on account of prices received. Okay, so it's not so much yield differences as between small and large farmers, but prices received. And I may give some example later. So in other words, small farmers receive lower prices, and this is not a surprise, than large farmers. For many reasons, they may sell immediately after harvest. They may be forced to sell to some trader they borrowed from. They may not be able to go to the further away wholesale market. They may sell in the village, etc. So because they're selling in smaller quantities. Of course, this will, oh my gosh, this is moving. This will vary across states, and in some states like Punjab, where minimum support price works, small farmers, large farmers all get the same price. So this is not a fact that is necessarily happening everywhere, but in large number of villages, this is what we find. Most recently in a study of Tamil Nadu in 2019, so that's more recent data. I've just been reading a paper on this by Abhi Sujit and Arindam Das, and they find that prices received by small farmers are lower than by large farmers, and prices received by Dalit cultivators are lower than that received by non-Dalit cultivators. Okay. This is another thing, caste. I'm not discussing too much today, but if you have questions, we can take it. So even the gross income, we haven't even come to net income, is different in many cases. I should say it's not always the case. Next, we look at the cost differences. So this table is the cost A2. No, I'll come later. What is cost A2? Are you all familiar with some cost concepts by now? Cost A2? No? Yes or no? No. Okay. So cost A2, the Commission on Agricultural Costs and Prices in India, and Indian government has different cost concepts which it uses to set the minimum support price. So I thought the farmers movement and their demands, all of you may be familiar with, they're asking for C2 cost plus 50% MSP. So cost A2 is the simplest of the costs. It is just the paid out costs. Okay, so that means whatever costs incurred. So no imputed costs, actual costs of production, whether it is for seeds or fertilizers or irrigation or machine hire, water, whatever it is. Now, I'll come later. There's one big problem in using this to compare small farmers and large farmers. What is one key cost that we should include? We should give an imputed value to. That's what I started with. What is the big difference between small farmers and large farmers? Of? No, labor, family labor, and land also. Because if we are saying that small farmers are putting in more family labor, they're hiring in a lot, but that doesn't mean they're not putting in. Then that should be imputed value. Otherwise, large farmers are, it's true, they're more dependent on wage labor. So I have a calculation later with family labor. But since a large part of the literature in India looks at cost A2, we looked at that too. And the main point I want to say is that the costs of production here, are calculated. We don't need to get into that. And then we calculate, this is the key variable, the net incomes. Okay, so the gross output or gross income minus cost of production only defined on A2 cost gives you the net income. So this table 9, I hope those online can see it. Yes, table 9, or they can't see the table number. What you're seeing is average incomes from net incomes from crop production per hectare of operational holding for small farmers and large farmers at 2010-11 prices in rupees per hectare. And let's just take the first villages. So again, with one exception, or one or two exceptions, the net income of small farmers is lower than that of large farmers. And most dramatic difference is in the first village in Anantavaram in Guntur district, where it's negative. And I'll come to this in another slide. We find a lot of negative incomes. What does negative income mean? How is it possible to have negative income? Not subsidized, no. It's losses. Because what happens is in the crop, a salaried person like me can never make a negative income. I may not get a salary for a month for whatever reason. It will be zero. Or a wage worker, have no employment, has zero income, but cannot have negative income. Whereas anybody in self-employment or business, which is what a farmer is, starts spending from June on water, on irrigation, on seeds, and gets the income in December. So there's a time duration also where you have to borrow credit, etc., or use up your own funds. And then if the net income you get in December or November or whenever you harvest the crop is lower than all your costs of production, then you've made losses. Okay, and I'll come to this. We find a significant proportion of small farmers having net negative incomes in every village we have studied, except two. And the two villages are the Punjab, Rajasthan Green Revolution type, wheat paddy growing, highly irrigated villages with MSP, etc. So I won't go into that now. So in the small farmers made a loss of 1,200 rupees and the large farmer made 1.5 lakh per hectare. And of course, the large farmer had more hectares. We're not talking about total income differences here. If you come to Bukacherla, there too, 3,000 and 11,000. And in some villages, the gap is less. In Punjab, it's 49,000 and 65,000. It's not such a big gap. And the very few small farmers in Punjab. In Gharsondi village in Madhya Pradesh, this was a year with a bad drought. And so actually the large farmer had invested a lot and the whole soybean crop failed. So the large farmer's income was actually a little less, 15,000 as compared to 60. Okay. So we have I'll just take a minute on this. So before exploring these differences a bit more, I think that one thing I'd like to again repeat about this heterogeneity of small farmer is that a small farmer in some villages is leave out the negative incomes, on average 3,000 to 10,000, in some villages 10 to 40, in some it's 40 to 50. So we have to be very careful in making a statement about small farmers. And I'll just give you an example here. I should have put this slide later. 3,000 to 10,000 per hectare. It's very, very low. And we're saying a small farmer is owning 2 hectares. This is the annual net income. So 2 hectares means 20,000 rupees per annum. Please understand the lowness of this. And these 3 villages are all dry villages, no irrigation. Zapur is Gulbarga, Anantapur, and Sikar. The higher income for small farmers is in the irrigated villages. So when there is better irrigation, when there's higher crop intensity, higher yields, small farmers also are better off. Okay, so that's the point I want to make here. Why these differences? That's another study, and you can ask me if you want, but I don't want to get into it. Now, we actually did a test to see whether these difference in income as between small, so this is a t-test for a difference of net income between small farmers and large farmers. And we excluded those villages which were only small farmer dominated, like some villages in, as I said, Kolar, which didn't, and we find that this test is significant for 4 villages. There's a significant difference in mean incomes. So I don't want to say that it happened in all villages, but these 4 villages with the star values, Anantavaram, Harevli, Western UP, Revasi in Rajasthan, and Tehang in Punjab. Except Revasi, the 3 are villages with very intensive cultivation, good level of irrigation, and high levels of investment, mechanization, and so on. Okay, so we could call them, high productivity villages in some way. And there you find that where there's more investment in agriculture is required, where cropping pattern is more intensive, so multiple cropping, where you need irrigation, the cost differences between small and large are very big, and the returns are therefore statistically significant. Having said that, we don't find that it's the other way. We don't find any village where the small farmer large farmer is getting lower returns, statistically significant lower returns than the small farmer. Okay, so let me before I go on, any questions from the online audience or here if there are? Yes. Okay, question is about differences in the prices received by small farmers and large farmers. When we do the comparison, we only do it for the same crop. We can't compare across crops. So, for example, I was just reading this morning this paper on 2 villages of Tamil Nadu, Nagapattinam district, and small farmers got for rice 16 rupees per kilo, large farmers got 18 rupees. And the reasoning was very clear. The small farmers sold it immediately after harvest. The large farmers not only sold their own crop, but they bought from small farmers, they aggregated, and they sold it to the state procurement. Tamil Nadu has procurement of rice, and state procurement price in Tamil Nadu, Kerala, etc. is much higher than even the national MSP on procurement price. So 2 rupees a kilo is quite a lot when you add it into the 1,000 kilos or whatever it is. Now, we had to, for my analysis, we have to include the imputed cost of that. Yeah, there's a question. Yes, please ask.
You were mentioning about the small farmers hiring using the hired labor. Can you give
Yes.
an idea about the composition of where the hired labor is coming from? So are these landless people or are these other small farm households, or is there any trend of that sort?
Okay, I will refer you to a recent paper by Nadu Shekhar and to its chapter in this book. What we find is that of the total labor used in crop production in agriculture, again, it varies by village, but for a large number of villages, about 40 to 50% comes from small farms. Okay, we could call them poor peasants or something, they could have different definitions. In other words, in order to survive, small farmers also work as wage workers, and this has been written about, and we're finding a lot of evidence of what we could call proletarianization of the peasantry. Okay, so peasantry, particularly small farmers, are still sticking on to their land, they're cultivating, but they are also engaging in wage labor. And at the same time, they're hiring labor to do their farming, because on a particular day, it's better for, in fact, in Anantavaram in Andhra, we actually find this. A small farmer per peasant is taking part in a group which does contract work of a transplanting on somebody else's field, earns wage labor in this way, and then 2 or 3 days later hires that group to work on his or her own farm. Okay, so there is both hiring in and hiring out of labor, and these ratios of hiring in and hiring out vary by class, of course, but they vary by village. And there is a paper in the last issue of the Review of Agrarian Studies by Nadu, where he has tried to estimate surplus labor. And in fact, although we've talked about Lewis and surplus labor, in recent times, nobody has actually done an empirical calculation. So he goes village by village and looks at what is the extent of labor days available, what is the extent of employment, what is the extent of surplus labor by month and season, and annual also. Okay, so composition differs, but and in some villages, okay, to answer the question you asked, in some villages, I mean, we know that most of our villages have huge unemployment. Okay, I'm not talking about that today. But in some villages in the peak season, they need to hire in workers from other villages. Whereas in the lean season, the same village may have unemployment and people migrating outside for work. So if your question is, do workers come in from other villages? Yes, it depends. If the internal labor supply within the village is not adequate. But I think largely, and of course you have, places where there's long-term migration, like, Bihari workers going to Punjab and so on for agriculture, where the entire labor, manual labor is not done by any Punjabi farmer, it's done by workers coming from Bihar, and, maybe other parts of India also now. So I hope that answers your question, and I can give you some readings after this lecture. Yeah.
This, have you confirmed this cash?
Caste factor, yes. Very good question that you've asked. In fact, this is there in the book that you wrote on Andhra Pradesh, which was published in 2006. In Andhra Pradesh, these small farmers who have negative incomes are largely Dalit tenant cultivators. So yes, in fact, I mentioned a little while ago that if we look at differentiation within small farmers by caste, there is not in every part of India, because largely in most parts of India, Dalits are landless and they are not cultivators. But where they have gained access to land, here it is largely by hiring in land. And I can tell you the reason why their income is negative also. It's because of the huge rent they have to pay to the landowner. So you have every other cost, and then you also have to pay, a huge rent. In Tamil Nadu, which I was talking about earlier, this 2 villages of Nagapattinam district, the cost for Dalits is higher because they don't own the machinery, so they have to hire in machine labor. They don't own the pump sets, they have to pay for irrigation water, whereas the large farmer or small farmer of other caste may have his own pump set or have machinery. And they have to pay, here also there is some land ownership now, but they lease in land and they have to pay rent. So yes, we have looked at it, and there are differences. And they're quite systematic. Again, I can't say it in every part of India, but there are systematic differences. But in large number of our villages, there are no Dalit cultivators because they're landless workers. And there's one village where we find a very different picture, and that is Kuch Bihar district in northern Bengal, where actually because of land reform, Rajbansis, they are Dalit households, but they are among the better off among the small farmers. Okay, so that was an exception that we found in North Bengal. Yes, there's another question. Yes.
Income from the like the amount of from if
Can I take your question in the end? Because it's not a direct, I can talk to you about this later. See, the extent of hiring in of labor by small farmers depends on kind of in a sense, you could say it depends on GVO in the sense that it depends on the cropping pattern, crop intensity, etc. So, but it depends also on an operation. So, very example, for rice cultivation, for example, transplanting and harvesting, or even for wheat for that matter, will be done by a machine or by hired labor, whether it's a small or large farm. Because crop is ready, you don't want to wait for some rain or hail or something, you want to harvest it quickly. Whereas some operations like weeding or fertilizer application, they may be done by the family labor, because it can be done, on one day. You can take time over it. You can do it over 3 days. So it depends on the intensity of cultivation and in some sense on GVO, but it depends, I think, more on the type of crop operation. And I would again refer you to Niladri on this. So if you can hold your question, and I will answer you more later. Yeah. Now, if we use the imputed value of family labor, then of course the gap between small farmer and large farmer differences increase or decrease? Decrease, because small farmers use more family labor than large farmer. That is not in doubt. Small farmers hire a lot of wage labor, but large farmers are using, and I'm not talking about landlords, as I said in the beginning, they don't use any family labor. Large farmers, rich peasants largely do supervisory work. So when somebody else is digging the field, they're there supervising. So they may be spending the day on the field and helping in some operations, but they're not doing all the necessarily, some of them do. But their use of family labor is much less. Women in large farmer families, we find, don't participate so much, whereas in small farmer families, wage worker families, women are very heavily involved in labor on their own farm and in wage labor. And please hold this thought. I'll talk about women at the end if I have time. So the differences are less, but they are there. Now, okay, I will take maybe another 5-10 minutes and then leave another 10 for questions. Now, yes, minus is, I told you, loss. Huh? In Bukacherla, yes. As I said, Bukacherla is an unirrigated area. They were growing groundnut. Now, sometimes there are losses made by large farmers also, because agriculture is risky. I'm not saying large farmers don't make losses, but as we'll see, it is how you can manage it. 1 year you make a loss. If you have some reserves, you can manage the next year. Whereas for small farmers, it may be indebtedness. Now, this table is quite interesting, and I think will answer your point. This is the proportion of, sorry, you can't see the title, number and proportion of small farmer households with negative incomes. 80% in Anantavaram, those tenants, Dalit tenant households, 42%, 56 in Revasi. What are these numbers? We are saying 50% in some villages have negative incomes. In some other villages, it's 13%, 9%, 2%. Okay. Sorry. I was looking at the numbers, not the percentage. Yeah. So 50, 35, 50, 52 is quite common. And I didn't give that number in the table, but I mean, I didn't give it in this slide here. But in each of these villages, the proportion of large farmers making losses is less. Okay. sorry. Yeah, I had put this, noted it down. So, for example, in Anantavaram, 35% of small farmers make losses. It's zero for large farmers. But in Bukacherla, 31% of large farmers also make losses. Okay. And so it's not that large farmers made losses, but in every village, the proportion of large farmers making losses was much less than that of small farmers. And although again, I would like to say this is cross-section data. So question that is often asked in a seminar, if I'm is, okay, this is 1 year, you studied it in 1 year, it was a bad year, it was a drought or something happened. Yes, maybe. But what we are also finding is that these bad years are recurring quite often. So give the example of Tamil Nadu, which because I was working on it last night, is 5 out of 7 years, there's a drought or there's a cyclone or there's some kind of natural disaster. So yes, if I may have collected data in a drought year, but if it's 5 out of 7 years, then I should be pretty worried about it. It is the kind of new normal, if you like. Oh, okay. Now, so I think the point that, again, to come to some conclusion, there are in this book, there's a chapter dealing fully with costs and prices by Arindam Das and Prakash Modak, and they look at irrigation costs, how they vary, small and large farmers. For example, in Bengal, again, the diesel pump sets are owned by the large farmers, so the cost to them is lower than it is for those who have to hire in the water, rent, seed costs, machine labor. Again, Punjab, there's a huge difference. Small farmers hardly own any of the equipment. Whereas if you go to a large farmer household, every type of combine harvester, driller, you name it, rotavator is sitting in their compound. So the costs of machine hire are obviously different and so on. One quick point, again, I don't have a slide on this, is fertilizer use. Because in this whole literature on ecological sustainability, and I started with that, fertilizer use is very important. There's a chapter by Kamal Murari and T. Jayaraman and Sanjay Chakrabarti. And the interesting finding is fertilizer application rate as between small farmers and large farmers is not very different. It varies by crop and it varies by type of irrigation. So when there's irrigated rice or wheat, all the farmers in the village, small and large, use heavy amounts of fertilizers. It's much less in other places. For cotton, it's more than for say, groundnut. But it's not very different. They didn't find any statistical differences between small and large farms. But very interesting in the global context, they found fertilizer use efficiency defined as output produced per unit of kg, output per kg, output to input ratio. No? So how many tons of paddy divided by how many tons of fertilizer, and they looked at it in value terms. So whether it's in value terms or quantity terms, fertilizer use efficiency in India is very low as compared to the world average. Okay, so our problem first is to get that problem sorted out. What is optimal fertilizer use, not small farmers and large farmers, and us, our large farmers more excessive as compared to small farmers, and therefore are small farmers more efficient in fertilizer use. Okay, so there's a chapter on this, and so I don't want to already, I think, too many numbers and tables, but let me come to some concluding points now. So there's a growing debate on the role of small farmers, and particularly in the international literature, you often find it's called family farms as opposed to large scale industrial corporate agriculture. And here we must note that in India, almost all farms are family farms. So when we are comparing small and large, it's still in the context of family run farms, not corporate agriculture, which does have very different characteristics. So I'm not comparing these small farmers with that. Secondly, to take small farmers as a group, whether it's the 2 hectare definition or whether it's sort of romanticized that they are not dependent on the market, they produce for their own consumption, they are more efficient in labor use, etc., etc. Small farmers are differentiated, they are heterogeneous, and we need to study the characteristics therefore of small farmers, and they're differentiated by caste as well. You know, I should add that as a conclusion, which has been pointed out importantly here. Now, some of the kind of evidence, I want to say a few words. Why did I use 10 village studies or 17 village studies? You know, it wouldn't it have been easier or more appropriate to use large-scale data from national sample surveys? Now, in India, from 2002-3 onwards, we do have these set of national sample surveys called situation assessment surveys of farmers. And some people are using that. I won't get into the problems of definition and so on. But the kind of detail about the investment, the ownership of machinery, ownership of pump sets, the kind of things that we want, as well as all the cost items that we've looked at, is unfortunately not available in the situation assessment survey. In fact, for the recent one, they didn't, they only even had paid out costs. So if you want to look at imputed value of family labor, and we have done imputed value of depreciation, cost of credit, imputed value of land also can be done, but then you'll find that Indian farmers are, all of them are at zero, so we didn't go into that. But we do look at cost of credit as well, which I didn't mention today. There's a chapter on access of small and large farmers. And no surprise, this cheap credit or relatively cheap credit is more accessible to large farmers than to small farmers. So, second point, that excluding tribal villages, it's very difficult to find small farmers who are not participating in the market. So again, this is a romantic view that small farmers rely on their own seeds, own inputs, own manure, and of course, fertilizers have to be bought, and their own labor, and this is rather misleading. Okay, and as we've already discussed in detail about wage labor and participation in wage labor markets. If we look at profitability, we do not see an inverse farm size profitability relationship. And why am I going on about this? Because there are people who are saying it still holds. And that's part of the myth about small farmers, that small farmers are in some way more productive. And there are a lot of papers still being written on that. I thought Sarthak has written on that, but I'm glad he hasn't, or his data are not showing that. In irrigated villages, particularly, with use of modern inputs and farming practices, technology, machinery, the small farmers are at much more of a disadvantage than large farmers in terms of income. And this is not surprising. So when there are higher returns to be had, when there's higher investment to be made in agriculture, the gap between small and large is also higher. I mean, it makes sense with our understanding of agriculture. Yeah, okay. So can we close this? Maybe some of those online participants may show their face for the questions. Any questions? Ask while they will. Yes, go ahead. Any other question? Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Then it's the same smaller family. Big ones, right? So the people who are having.
What is your question? I can't understand your question. What is your question?
Yes. Like, in terms of owning a land.
Yes, yes,
Don't you think you own it equally?
yes, 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 whatever, yeah.
But that's it. It's a kind of keeping your small farmer prime land, productive land inside the building.
Okay. Yeah, so question, the comment.
Leftover land kind of things we have for this.
Yeah, so you are agreeing with what I'm saying. No. Please understand. Okay, there are two questions here. If there's any online question, in a village, there are, even though there are inequalities and discrimination, not just inequality, discrimination, that doesn't mean there are no social relations between employers, employees, tenants, landlord. The landlord will give you credit, may help you in some. So there's, please don't misunderstand. I did not talk about those social relations at all in my lecture today. Second, I did not give a statistic, but it is established that in every village there is huge concentration of land, monopoly of land control by a few households, not only few castes, but few households. We have data that the top 5% of households own very often 50% of the land. So that obviously changes the relationships in a village. Now, many small farmers are productive. In fact, I said the yield differences are not, we do not find yield differences. Output per hectare is not different. If maybe you missed that, and I did emphasize it. What is different is income per hectare. Because the cost to the small farmer, he has to buy the water from the one who has a pump set, he has to hire the machine, he has to pay the rent. So the cost to the small farmer are often, in many cases, higher than to the large farmer. And the price he gets for the output, not always, but in many cases, is lower, either because he sells to the local trader, he doesn't have that truck to take it to the city or whatever, or for whatever multiple reasons. And therefore the income is less, not the output. You're totally right, and if I said it, it is wrong. There's a question on women's labor, I'll come to that, but let's have an online question. There was an online question.
This could be a slight digression, maybe. You were referring about the. Hello? Am I
Yes.
audible? Okay.
Yes,
You
yes.
were referring about the small farmers using less amount of manure when it is made, when it's not homemade. So can you give an idea about the commercial aspect of this organic manure?
The composition of organic manure? No, what did you say?
No. The commercial aspect, like how is it priced relative to the chemical fertilizers?
Yeah, what about manure use? Combination?
The pricing aspect.
Oh, pricing. Okay, pricing of manure is very difficult. Please don't ask me about that because it is not, there is no market for manure. And if everybody is to become organic tomorrow, we'll have to increase our cow population by about 50 times. So there's very limited manure, and these are negotiated in the village. And we try to find out from some people who buy cartloads or truckloads of manure. So it varies in each village. I can't offhand tell you the price, but if you message me, I can find out what is the kind of price per cart of manure. Any other question online? No problem. So in this definition of small farmer, I should have clarified. I said it's 2 hectares of operational holding. That means operational holding means cultivated holding, not ownership. So if I own land in the village and I'm sitting here and I've rented it out to somebody, the person operating it will be called as a small farm. Okay. If you're landless and not cultivating, for this analysis, you're not there. In our other study of the villages, you're there. So anybody who's operating land, whether it is owned or leased in, is included. Now, let me say a bit about women's work, because I think you have a lecture in the afternoon, and I did a book on this last year, 2020, I think, on women's work in rural India. So what we find is that women, it varies a little bit it varies by caste, it varies by region, but on the whole, we can say that there is high participation of women in agricultural activities. So, for example, for some reason in West Bengal, women are not so, in peasant households or even wage labor households. They do a lot of processing, like what is it called, bhajati muri and all that, but not in direct harvesting, threshing, but in large parts of India, including South India particularly, women's participation in all crop operations is higher. And actually, we find that of total hired labor use, again, these papers are showing this, the share of women's labor is higher than men. So when it is family labor, it tends to be more men than women. When it is hired labor, this is a big generalization for India, there's much more women. So women's labor is very high. Having said that, in almost every part of India, again, the exception is Bengal, there's a big gap between male and female wages. Bengal is the only state where male and female wages are equal. And this is because the Agricultural Wages Act and actually has prescribed equal wages. And the villages, of course, in the implementation may not be 100%, but then you'll find the gap is much narrower. In almost every state of India, the gender wage gap is there, and if anything, it has even grown in many states. So that's very unfortunate, because women are very actively participating, but getting a much lower earning from the work that they put in. Any other question online? Yes. Hello, Bujirali, yeah.
We found that women participation. The other crop was
No, it varies. The question is about women's participation by the Karnataka, I'll answer later, by crop. And yes, it varies. It's very high in rice. And in cotton, for example, for cotton picking, women are very important. It is women's labor is quite high. So in sugarcane harvest, so it depends. It depends on the crop. So there is a gender division of labor, but it's not immutable. And what we find is it's also changing. So when you have new machines come in, or you have men who have migrated, so depending on the local situation, sometimes this gender division of labor changes, but you'll rarely find, we have not found a tractor driver who's a woman. Okay. So there is a gender division of labor, and it varies by crop operation. There's a question there. Yes. 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 Yes.
small farmers. They sell their market.
Yes.
They don't have a system. They don't support that.
Except Punjab. Yeah. Some places. Yeah.
price. If our production is not consumed, but if we ensure a good price, if we are good there, but a small marginal farm, then I think there should be a provision for the prices.
Yeah, okay. So the question is about price risk that small farmers are facing. Okay, if I can shorten your question because they won't know you haven't heard the question. Let me give an example which is there, which I didn't discuss, is Bengal, very highly productive agriculture, as many of you know, rice, potato, rice. And the year we did this survey, the price of potato crashed. And so there was a huge losses. And people have talked about price stabilization fund, whether it is for rubber in Kerala or, so the prices are increasingly affected by global shocks, commodity, supply chains or whatever. So having price stabilization fund is a discussion that is going on, and we can take that offline if that is satisfies you for now. You have a second question? Quickly, huh?
When there is no evidence for inverse answer. This opinion, then there is no even if corporate farming, cooperative farming.
Yeah.
If both of these cooperative farming, then productivity and efficiency may enhance. But what about the well-being and welfare of farmers?
Okay, so question is about, if small farmers are not doing so well, which I've tried to show. I should have said this in the end. So what do we do? I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that small farmers, let's give up hope. No, small farmers are 85% of our farmers. So how do we give them economies of scale? So in fact, there's a little section on policy, which I didn't talk about. How do we ensure that small farmers, so through cooperatives, can we make machinery available, or through farmer produce organization, can we ensure that prices are better, or through price stabilization fund, through cooperative farming? So there are a lot of discussions going on, and I think that is the way to go forward. Small farmers are going to remain with us in India for many years to come. How do we ensure better incomes from them? Not just a dole, not just 6,000 a year or something, that's a subsidy, but how do we ensure that they get the latest technology at a good price? So let me just take an example of irrigation. In the 70s and 80s, a large part of irrigation, or even 60s in India, was public sector irrigation, which was canal irrigation. In the 90s onwards, the growth is of private tube well irrigation. So you see the public canal irrigation, even today, in areas where it's available free to small farmers, large farmers, anybody in that watershed. Whereas private irrigation at tube well is so many rupees per acre. So we can go on like this, but I think there are issues here. So if we did not have purely private and public, we could have in between, as you say, cooperative irrigation system. Again, there's an example in West Bengal, in one of the villages where we studied, where the panchayat regulates the price of water that is sold. So you can have some control over this. So I've given a bit of a doom and gloom picture today, maybe, but it's not necessarily that. And I think we all need to break for lunch. And thank you all for the online audience as well.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a very, very insightful presentation, and all of us, we gained a lot. I'm sure many of us have many questions. They might want to get in touch with you, speak with you offline. So I would ask them to get in touch with you. Anyway, thank you. Let's break for lunch. At 2 o'clock, we have our next session, and we'll all join at 2. Thank you.